Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're going to be making some heavy-duty floating shelves. Now, normally on the show, in fact, never on the show, have I incorporated other types of work with my woodworking. But today we're going to make an exception here because I thought it could be a fun project, and for those of you that have access to this sort of stuff, you might enjoy this project. And what that other process is welding, in particular stick welding or arc welding. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to be making the brackets that mount to the wall out of steel and welding those up. And that is what makes these particular floating shelves heavy duty. For those of you who have seen my model builds that I do, I basically want to make shelves or floating shelves that will hold these models because they're just taking over my house. They're everywhere. So I'd like to get them into one room on floating shelves, but they have to be able to hold the weight because some of them are quite heavy. If you don't know what I'm talking about with these model builds, maybe you might want to click on the Facebook link for this channel's Facebook page, and there's a lot of stuff that gets posted on there that you guys don't see here on the show. So either way, let's start off by making the brackets, and we're going to start off with the steel that we're going to use. Well, here we are at the bench, and this is the basic raw material that we will be using to weld up our heavy-duty shelf brackets. And what we have is some 1/4 inch thick flat bar. I'm not sure of the width of it here, just a second. 1.5 inches. So 1/4 inch by 1.5 inch flat bar. And then we have some 1 inch square tubing. And the wall thickness of the tubing is 1/8 of an inch thick. Now, we're going to be using the flat bar to mount against the wall, and I'm hoping to use it with 16-inch centers for our studs in our wall. So for that, we're going to need to cut a piece of the flat bar at 18 inches long. That will give us 1 inch on either side of our wall studs. And for a general purpose for all of these, because I will be making multiples of these brackets and multiples of these shelves, these floating shelves, I want these 1 inch tubes, or the 1 inch square tubing here, I want this to be 8 inches long. So we're going to need one piece of the flat bar at 18 inches and 2 pieces of the square tubing at 8 inches each. Well, now that you've got your pieces cut, you want to take them over to the grinding wheel and take off any of these burrs that the metal cutting saw left in them. Just something I want to point out, you may have noticed in the clip where I'm cutting, I've got those blankets that are around, hanging around the corners and stuff like that. Those are welding blankets, and they help to prevent the arcs and sparks from causing fires in your shop, because you want to remember where you are. And where you are was in a woodworking shop, and there's sawdust on the floor and on things. And sawdust, of course, is combustible. So safety here, guys. Use something to deflect these sparks. In my case, it is welding blankets. And as well, gloves for handling the steel, eyeglasses, safety glasses for when you're cutting and grinding, as well as a full face shield, guys. It's imperative. Anything could happen. It's dangerous stuff. Get the gear on and save your eyes, save your hands, the whole 9 yards. Either way, take this now, grind these things down and get those burrs off, and then after that, we can head back to the bench. The next step, now that you have all of the burrs and everything taken off of these pieces, is you want to mark for your mounting holes. Now, I'd said that I wanted to put these on a wall that has 16-inch centers for studs, and that's why we have cut these pieces to 18 inches, because it gives an extra inch of overhang on each edge after we mark for the 16 inches. So if we mark 1 inch in from each of these outside edges, just like this, and then center it on this 1.5 inch piece of steel here, we will end up with holes that are at 16 inches to center. I know that's kind of hard for you guys to see, but I'm going to be drilling a 1/4 inch hole now at each one of these marks, right in the middle of these pieces. And we can just mark it off here. 3/4 is the center. And it really isn't that imperative that you're perfectly on center for this, because when you actually mount the brackets, you're going to be mounting the brackets using a level, of course, to make it proper. But we will use a punch and whack these to give us a divot, and then I'm going to take it over to the drill press and drill a 1/4 inch mounting hole at each one of those marks. Well, at this point in the game now, we've got these sexy little 1/4 inch holes drilled at 1 inch in from each end. We've double checked them and made sure that they're 16-inch centers, and they're pretty much right on the money, which is great. But now we want to take a mark in from each end, and we want to put a mark at 3 inches in. Just like that. Do it on each end of the 1/4 inch steel. And what this is going to represent will be the outside edge of each one of our 8-inch pieces. And I'm just going to use this square just to give me a better reference line here. What that means is our square tubing now, just take a couple of them here, these are going to get welded just like this. One will go here and one will go here. And this is the part that makes this the heavy-duty version of the floating shelf. These brackets with those 1/4 inch steel backer plates being screwed directly into a stud, and with these thick, heavy 1 inch square steel rods here being welded in place, you have got one heck of a lot of structure here. This is almost overkill. And I know that there are going to be those of you out there that's going to say that this is overkill, and I'm okay with that, because these things are holding models that have taken me hundreds of hours to make, and I really don't want them falling and being destroyed. So now that we've got our pieces cut, ready to go, we've got them sitting here the way that we want them laid out. Now it's time to get into some arcing and sparking with the welding machine. Now here comes the fun part, for me anyway. This is where we get to do the welding. But you have to remember, again I'll say it's very dangerous. So you'll want to get rid of this outfit, which is a woodworking outfit, and change it from this to this. And of course, don't forget the respirator. Guys, I just want to say I'm not an expert at welding. Don't for 1 second think that I am. I am an amateur at it. So any of you guys that want to come on here and say you're not doing this right, or you're not doing that right, or whatever, that's fine. If you want to give constructive criticism below and maybe give me a few tips or something, that's great. I'm okay with that. But this isn't a welding show. This is a woodworking show, and the welding is just secondary here. So I'm not going to get into methods or anything like that. If you really want to know the size rod and the amperage I'm using, you can ask below. But other than that, let's get these pieces welded up. Well, that's the welding portion done. So it's time to get rid of this welding gear. Whoops, too far. That's better. Almost turned this into a completely different kind of show. Anyway, guys, the welding is done. I don't know what to say about it. Like I said, I'm not a good welder. I stick metal together. I got good penetration on the welds. It's a strong weld, but I probably will take the grinder to it and clean it up. And then what you want to do with your brackets from there is paint them. This will prevent them from rusting or turning or whatever, and it just makes the whole project a lot cleaner. So I'm going to spray paint these black, and then once we're done with the spray painting and they're all dried up, we're going to move on to the next step. Well, like I said, I'm no great welder, but I did take the grinder to them just to clean them up a bit. You can see it here before the paint, and now we're just going to give it a coat of spray paint, and it'll be black will be my choice, whatever color you like. So paint them up. Well, now that you've got your brackets done and painted up and they're all dry, it's time to make the actual shelves themselves. And the way that these shelves are constructed is there's actually kind of like a skeletal frame inside, and they're sandwiched around, or sandwiched with plywood on the outside. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by making the skeletons for these. And for that, you're going to need some 3/4 inch pine. So the reason that we've chosen pine for our skeleton of these shelves is basically for a weight factor. None of these frames will ever be seen. They'll be completely concealed within the shelf itself. So pine is a lighter wood, and yet it's going to give us the stability that we need across the entire shelf and be very, very functional. Plus, it's cheap. So what we're going to have to do is take this over to the table saw, and we're going to have to cut some strips that are 1 1/8 of an inch wide. Well, now that you have the stock cut for your skeleton pieces, you need to decide how big your shelf is going to be. For mine, the shelves are going to be 10 inches wide by 22 inches long. So to start with the skeleton, I want some of that pine. I want one piece cut at 22 inches, and I'm going to want 2 pieces cut at 9 1/4 inches long. So now that you have those pieces cut, you need 4 more pieces, and those pieces are going to be 8 7/8 of an inch long. Well, I've got my metal bracket here, and I just have a scrap piece of pine on the back end of it, and it's just to represent the wall and help us with alignment. So I'm just going to show you how the assembly of the skeleton goes together, and then we're going to get into the actual mechanics of putting it together. But what you're going to have is your 22-inch piece will be in the front, just like this, and then you have your 9 1/4 inch pieces, which are going to butt up against your 22-inch piece and then against the wall. So your 9 1/4 plus your 3/4 inch thick piece, that gives you your 10-inch wide shelf here as far as the maple or the plywood goes. Now you have your pieces here at 8 7/8, and they are going to be sandwiching these steel 8-inch piece of the bracket. And you want to leave an 1/8 of an inch gap. So if you're doing a 22-inch shelf and you followed the measurements here so far, what you can do is you can cut a couple pieces of scrap pine that are going to be 3 7/16 of an inch wide, or long rather, and they will sit in place on your build, and that will give you the gap that you require to place your uprights on the sides. Just shift this a bit here because we're not quite centered, and that's why we have these spacer pieces. They'll also end up being support pieces afterwards. They're not just for aligning. And then we have another piece here that is going to actually be 8 1/8 inch long, and that will be the spacer that will go between these pieces here, just like that. So this is the basic assembly of our skeleton. These spacer pieces will end up getting moved during our actual assembly, but this is what we're looking at for a skeleton of our shelf. So now that we have the basic layout, we have all of our pieces cut, let's put this thing together. Well, now that we've got all the pieces cut to their final lengths, it's time for the assembly. And the thing I love about the assembly of these frames is there's no sanding. You don't have to mess around with them. If there's some extra pieces that are sticking off to the side or whatever, sure, you can clean them up, whatever you like, but you really don't have to because it's all concealed. So we're going to start off with one of our end pieces here, which is our 9 1/4, and it gets mounted right into the butt end of this. So we're just going to line up with a square, put a little bit of glue on there, and we're going to shoot it in with some 1 1/4 brad nails and an air nailer. Well, the next thing that you want to do is take your 3 7/16 inch spacer piece, just sit it in between here like this, and take another one of your, or you take one of your short pieces, which is your 8 7/8, line it up here against the edge, a little bit of glue, and then a couple brad nails, same as we did this piece over here. Sit it in place, push it in, use your square to make it pretty. Once you get it all lined up, just a couple of brad nails to hold it in place. Now that you've got that done, we're going to be using some setup blocks, but first we're going to take that same spacer, we're going to place it at the opposite end here, right in here, glue on both ends, hold it together, and just shoot a couple brad nails in it to hold it in place. Now you may notice that I've got a piece of hardboard here with some wax paper. That's just to prevent any of the squeeze out from gluing this to my bench and to make sure that we get a nice flat surface to assemble everything on. So now that you've got that done, we're going to move along the shelf this way, and we need to put a spacer now in between here. I'm just going to use some setup blocks, and we need 1.25 inch spacer in here, and then we're going to mount another one of our 8 7/8 inch pieces. Now you want to take your 8 1/8 inch spacer piece, place it up against the one that you just put in, take another 8 7/8 inch piece, glue it in place, square it up, and a couple brad nails, put her in place. Now that same spacer that you just had here, just as we did at this end, we're going to move it to the top, glue on both sides, and we're going to shoot a few brad nails into it. We may have a little trouble getting 2 into this side, but we're going to try to maybe shoot down on an angle and see how we make out. And we'll just flip it over and try to get one in from the other side. I missed. No big deal. There we go. Okay, carrying right along now. We'll put our 1.25 inch spacer in here, and once again, add the next upright piece. And then, as we did before, the 3 7/16 of an inch spacer, and we will put our last piece on the end here and staple it in, move our spacer up, and staple it together. Just like that. Check it for square. And then just shoot it in place. Now that you have that piece in place, just take your spacer, shift it up top, and glue and shoot that one in as well. And there we have the skeleton of our floating shelf. Now, I'm not worrying about any of the burrs on the wood. I didn't worry about any of the squeeze out. All of that is going to be covered up. The only thing I worried about was to make sure that everything here is flush, that each piece that joins is flush with the other, and that the assembly is square. If there's squeeze out that comes out above this surface here, above this flat surface, you need to take care of that, because if not, it's going to dry and not allow the actual surface of the shelf to sit flush. So let me just show you the principle of what we have here and how it mates with our metal hardware or bracket that we welded up. So here we have our steel bracket and the skeleton that we just made, and this bracket, just pretend it's screwed to the wall. Use your imagination here, guys. And the whole shelf will just slide onto this bracket and butt up against the wall back here. And then the steel is completely enclosed. Now, you won't see any of this workings once the shelf is complete, of course, because we need to cover this now and build the rest of the shelf around this skeleton. And that is going to be the next step that we carry on with. And that would be all the time we have for this week. I never really expected this to be a two-part build, but apparently somehow it bled into that. But that's okay. I'm not in a rush, and hopefully neither are you. Which brings me to my next point, that I hope you're going to join me again next week for part 2 of this floating shelf and yet another. woodworking video. Thanks for joining me, guys.